I'm on mute. I'm told I'm on mute. We're off mute. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Wow, that was great. Good. Thank you. So we have a great program, and I promise I'm going to get out of the way so that we can start the program. But just a few housekeeping items. One, we'll have a moderated discussion, and then towards the end of the program, we will have time for some questions. For those that are here, you have some cards. Please just fill them out and pass them to Kira or Joe or myself, and we'll make sure we get as many to our panel as possible. If you're watching virtually, please just use the Q&A function and we will get them here, and we'll again get as many to our panelists as we can. So again, thank you for being here. It's exciting to be back at the Union League, and we hope to see you many, many more times over the next couple of months, both here and at our other locations, which I'll tell you a little bit more at the end of the program. And with that, I'm going to introduce my boss, the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Ms. Joan Carter. Joan.
Thank you, John. I am really, really pleased that the Legacy Foundation is presenting this program. I think it is a topic that is of primary importance to our country, and that is education, particularly K through 12 education. It's not only well documented, but it certainly is self-evident that the quality of an individual's education is the most important determinant of their success in life. Financial success, professional success, personal success. The importance of education is also played out in the budgets of our states. 30% of state budgets deal with education. So the problem is that with all this attention and all this money, we are not succeeding. The United States ranks in the bottom half or worse of all industrialized countries in science and math competency. And the failure is most acute in the students who need it the most, which is the low income students. So what can we do to give all students a chance for a quality education? Well, tonight we have two experts on the subject who will help us to better understand the issues and will present us with some solutions. So our moderator is Michael Moreland. Michael is a professor of law and religion and director of the McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Politics at Villanova University. And Michael will introduce our experts in a moment. But before that, I do want to share something with you that I thought was very apropos to this moment. And it is a quote from the patron saint of the Union League, Abraham Lincoln. And he says, "Upon the subject of education, not presuming to dictate any plan or system respecting it, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in." Michael, up to you.
Thank you, Joan. It's great to be here. I've done a few of these programs as a moderator before, and it's always a privilege. So I will introduce our speakers, our panelists, and then I'll start asking them some questions. So Lenny McAllister is the CEO of the Pennsylvania Coalition of Charter Schools. He has been a champion for education equity, civil rights, and policy reforms as a leading voice on the local, state, and national level. He previously was at the Commonwealth Foundation, where he provided policy analysis and advocacy on multiple issues that affect the lives of Pennsylvanians. His policy focus includes education equity, criminal justice reform, economic empowerment, race relations, and community engagement. He's appeared regularly as a nationally renowned op-ed writer, political analyst, and media figure on outlets ranging from Radio New Zealand, that's a long way away, Sirius XM and the CBC, to CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. He has worked with policy and civil rights leaders on both sides of the aisle throughout the nation over the course of his public career, and he is a graduate of Davidson College in North Carolina. Donna Cooper is the Executive Director of Public Citizens for Children and Youth, the Greater Philadelphia region's leading child advocacy organization that influences elected officials by combining useful research, practical solution-oriented policy recommendations with the mobilization of citizens who advance the organization's work on behalf of children. Prior to her position there, Cooper was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she led the center's research on early childhood education, public infrastructure, and was a contributing researcher to the center's work to reduce poverty. She served as the Secretary of Policy and Planning for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 2003 to 2010, where she was responsible for the state's education, public support, environmental, and healthcare policy. She served as the City of Philadelphia's Deputy Mayor of Policy and Planning from 1999 to 2002, where she designed and led the Greater Philadelphia Works program. She holds a master's degree in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a master's degree in intercultural management from the School for International Training. Welcome to both of you. Thank you. So, Donna, let me begin. As we kind of talked about in a meeting to plan for this, I think maybe start by just kind of laying out the landscape, because a lot of people here probably come from different levels of expertise. There are some who probably get their school tax bill in the mail and pay it, and that's all they know about school funding and how it works. Some others might have more policy experience in this area. So maybe if you could just briefly, and I know it's a challenge, briefly talk about the types of schools in Pennsylvania. Let's keep the focus on Pennsylvania for now, how they're funded, and just basically what the infrastructure looks like.
Sure. Oh, thank you very much. And I appreciate the people who came in person and wherever the Zoom land is, people too. So think about it. We have about 1.7 million children in public school in Pennsylvania. About 10% of them attend charter schools. And some of those students are in cyber charters, and some of those students are in bricks and mortar charters. Most of them are in bricks and mortar charters. And I'll talk a little bit about how they're funded, but the other 10% are in private schools. So they could be in parochial schools, religious schools, or just private schools, right? So by and large, most of the children are attending traditional public schools in Pennsylvania, and that's pretty common around the country. Some states have a little bit more students in, a little larger share of students in charter schools than us, but not significantly larger. And in Pennsylvania, and uniquely to PA, most of the school funding for our schools comes from local taxes. So Pennsylvania is a state that's very heavily reliant on local taxes. So the state's paying about 32% of the funding of schools, and about 7% is coming from the federal government, and the balance or the majority is coming from local taxpayers. The state money does go more directly to districts that are lower income than upper income. So for instance, for every 10 cents that Lower Merion gets, we get a dollar. So Philly gets way more than Lower Merion. But in general, the amount that the state distributes across the school districts is not able to equalize the difference of the property tax reliance. So we have the greatest disparity in terms of per student expenditure between the wealthiest districts and the poorest districts in the country. So that's sort of the lay of the land on the expenditure. And then we are a state that is somewhat unique in that charters are authorized in Pennsylvania only by school districts. Many states have what's called a statewide authorizer, like in New York State, if any of you are familiar, the higher ed system there can authorize charter schools. In Maryland, the higher ed system can authorize charter schools, but the definition of what's a charter really varies state by state. So in Maryland, for instance, a charter school is not a private or nonprofit run entity. It's run by the school district, but it's specially chartered by an authorizer, in that case, a higher ed authorizer. In New York State, looks a lot like us. School districts can authorize charters or the state can. Philadelphia is unique. It's the only school district in the state where the school board has no taxing power. So Philadelphia's school board cannot impose taxes for the schools. City council does. And that came as part of the 1956 Home Rule Charter. Somebody here know the year of Home Rule Charter? I forget the year Philly became home rule. But anyhow, so there's a uniqueness where our school board is a policy decision maker, but it is dependent on city council to come up with the funds for the schools. For those of us who live here, the city council has in the last 12 years authorized about 13 tax increases for the schools. Some of those had to be done because in 2011, there was $1 billion cut across the state to school funding. And so the city had to step up and increase its share. It's a lot of individual small tax increases. Philly ranks 30th in the state for its share of income going into the district. So it's making a big effort. But just to give you the final lay of the land here, all the effort of Philadelphia doesn't make up for the fact that the state's funding in general, it ranks 44th in the country in terms of state dollars per student expenditure of state money. So when you spread that across the 1.6 million students, Philly gets a good amount of money, but not enough to compensate for a quality education. I was having a spirited conversation, and I said that the difference is that in Lower Merion, they'll have more than twice the amount to spend per student, and they're getting twice the results. Now, Lower Merion is spending more than is necessary, although it is spending less than most private education. It's still spending more than is necessary. But their rate of expenditure in Philadelphia is also what is essentially transferred to charter schools. So if Philadelphia is educating a student for about $11,000, they're sending about 10,700 or 10,500, maybe 10,000, 11,000, 10,000 to the charter schools. So the amount that a district spends directly affects the amount that a bricks and mortar charter is paid or a cyber charter is paid. So the final point, if a child is going to a cyber charter from Lower Merion, they are paying that cyber charter about $24,000 a year. If Philly's sending a student to a cyber charter, they're spending about $11,000 or $10,000 a year. So we have a kind of a very strange way of paying cyber charters. We're not the only state, but one of few states that does it that way. But the disparity in state funding has a similar financial impact on bricks and mortar charter as it has on traditional public schools. We have an academic outcome problem across the state. I mean, we're not top of the country by any stretch in terms of, aggregating all the student results. For a while in 2008, we were top of the 8th grade math scores, and we were about 3rd in English, but we've really been surpassed by other states. Massachusetts and Maryland routinely are in the top. So there's also a lot of families that choose to live in those states because they get such a high quality education. Their states are higher investors, and they also have more rigorous standards for teachers. How do you become a teacher? They also both have charters, but it seems to me that the landscape isn't simply affected by choice, it's affected by resources and the expectations of what it takes to be a school leader and a teacher.
That puts a lot of issues out there. Lenny, let me turn over to you. If you want to qualify or respond to any of the things that Donna said about the landscape, but then also focusing specifically on charter schools. And as a native Minnesotan, my understanding is that as many good ideas, it came from Minnesota originally. First charter school statute was in my native state of Minnesota. But if you want to focus specifically on charter schools and why charter schools, in your view, are an answer to many of the education policy problems that we see.
Well, good evening, everybody, and I just want to say thank you for joining us. I thank Donna for being here. Michael, thank you for joining us. Joan, good to see you again. John, Kira, Joe. I think about when I testified before the Pennsylvania State Senate back in 2019, and I started out with a quote. It's online because we had the written testimony as well. And I quote Dr. Steve Perry. He's an education leader throughout the United States, was CNN analyst, had an opportunity to work with him several times. And he said, at the current rate of education, without immediate and intentional intervention, it will take the average African American 233 years to catch up academically to their white peers. And it will take the average Latino American roughly 80 years to catch up to their white peers. So what are we looking at? If we look at just the funding, which You know, Donna, very respectfully, you literally spent 90% of what you were talking about on funding. The first thing I'm going to is the kids, because we're at a crisis in America right now. And that was before the pandemic. African Americans and Latino Americans are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, academically, economically, from a healthcare perspective, and from a psychological perspective. We know that this country is getting browner and more diverse. We know that we are geopolitically and geoeconomically competing with a world that is more and more sliding away from us. Joan mentioned the numbers herself. When you start talking about what we need to do, we have to go back to focusing on that child first and foremost. What's the best academic fit? What's the best developmental fit? Every kid's not going to necessarily be an A student, but that's not the purpose of school choice. The purpose of school choice is to say, what's the best fit for your self-determination in life? We're sitting here in the Union. We're sitting here in Philadelphia. And the Declaration of Independence talks about self-determination. Well, guess where the one place in American society you don't get self-determination? If you're a poor person in Northeast Philly and you can't move out of your neighborhood and you can't choose what school you go to, it's the only place in America where we tell poor people you can only be certain things because you can't have self-determination because of your zip code. That is un-American, that is wrong, and we cannot continue to be global leaders if we're going to continue with that. So let's talk about what charter schools do. Charter schools are the only guaranteed option for self-determination and education in America today. Now you could say, well, what about tax scholarships? They're great. Look, I'm a scholarship kid. My dad sacrificed. He made sure that we were able to go to some of the best schools. He's a working class guy. But you got to be able to pass that test. You got to be able to have a little bit of money. You got to hope that that endowment has an amount of money that can cut a check for you. But with school choice through public education, charter schools, you at least have an option. Now, there's some barriers to it. Your luck of the draw is literally up to a lottery right now. So for you to get into a better school than some of the schools that we've seen in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh and in Erie and in Harrisburg for generations, you better hope that you get the right number. It's like saying you're going to wait to get your rent check if you win the Pennsylvania lottery on Thursday. We wouldn't plan on that, now would we? But we do know with public charter schools, giving parents a choice, we have two things. Number one, that charter school law from 1997 is supposed to push innovation and make district schools and charter schools better for Pennsylvania families. We've lost that because we talk more about money than we talk about children. The other thing that charter schools do is it forces competition, which we need. Everybody's walking around here with a little computer in their purse or in their pocket right now. Because Apple decided to compete with IBM before some of you were even born. And innovation took over. And as a result, we now walk around with our phones and a computer in our purse or our pocket. Why do we think that's good with our car, with our computer, with our cell phone? But the kids that need it the most, that have been on the periphery of society for generations, shouldn't be able to benefit from the same. Charter schools start to remedy that.
Donna, maybe my role here is just say, well, what do you think? But maybe to focus specifically, I'm not an expert on education policy or law, but I know enough to make myself dangerous. I mean, you do hear in the debate, you hear a lot about competition, right? And that what the public schools, which as you say are 80% of students in the Commonwealth and so forth across the country, that what they need is competition for accountability and so forth. What's your response to that?
So again, if we're just placing it in Philly, we have about 180 district-run schools, and I think we're at like 86 charter schools. So there are 300 schools plus the 16 cyber charter choices to students in Philadelphia. And in fact, most kids don't go to their neighborhood school. Their kids are choosing to go. In fact, typically about a third of kids are going to their neighborhood school, unless you live, if any of you are Philadelphians, if you live in Greenfield or Meredith, you're going there, everybody else is just moving around. And we have obviously select magnet high schools, Masterman, Central, Girls High, Science Leadership Academy, and the charters. There's a lot of choice in Philadelphia. And the thing that troubles me the most is that for far too many kids, and I think Lenny hopefully would agree, the choices aren't very good, charter or public. We have some lousy charters, and we have some lousy publics. We have some great charters, and we have some great publics. And typically when you disaggregate the data and you look at the charters that are performing well or the district schools that are performing well, they're mostly educating children from more stable families and modestly more income, right? So the deeper the poverty of the school, regardless of whether it's charter or public, the worse the results, and especially the density of poverty in that building. So there's no charter that has the same share of children in poverty and the density of a traditional neighborhood elementary school that it has 50% of their kids reading on grade level. And there's no neighborhood elementary school of the same demographics that has 50% of their kids, they're all lower than 50% of their kids reading on grade level in the 4th grade. And so actually, Joan, it was interesting you kicked this off on K-12, because I wonder if you've heard of Jim Heckman. Jim Heckman is a Nobel-winning economist from the University of Chicago, a strong conservative. And his analysis is that we wait too long to begin investing in kids' education. And that if we can remedy the learning loss or the competitive learning loss between poor children and their white peers before they enter school, we are going to see better outcomes in the long term. And that's what he won his Nobel on. And that was what made the argument for early, high quality early childhood education and pre-K. Because the kids starting school with 100,000 fewer words and no vocabulary, if they're poor, whether they're coming going to a charter or a public school, that teacher has a hard time. So we have one, we're starting to invest too late in the high quality early childhood education, and that the only proven strategy we've seen in this country, now that might be just by what research has been done, right? Because you only know what's proven by what's being researched. But the only proven strategy where we've actually seen children leave poverty at scale is as a result of Get to That Head Start and high quality pre-K. But we're talking about K-12. So the same goes for early reading. So one of the things that happens when you become a teacher in Pennsylvania is you go to a school of education. Same whether you're a charter teacher or you're a traditional teacher. You may or may not have an education degree, English degree. You may or may not know how to teach reading. And sadly, for kids who don't learn naturally, reading is rocket science, teaching it. For me, I had no trouble. Lenny probably had no trouble. Joe had no trouble. Everybody, we learned to read. But where kids don't learn, it's complicated to teach them. Where they're not thinking, that their neurons are not going the same way as everybody else's or most people's. So fundamentally, if kids are not coming into school prepared to learn with good cognitive development, and they're going to a charter school or a traditional school, and we have teachers who are not taught the basics of how to prepare them to shift from reading to learn. So I learned from the first grade 1 to 4 is called learning to read, and it's the general term read, right? Math, fundamentals, and then reading to learn to read, reading to learn. Fundamentally, what we see in Philadelphia, what we see in Lancaster, what we see in Allentown, is that we have a severe deficit in teachers who really know how to communicate to the 40 to 45% of children who aren't learning to read. And so in my mind, the crisis isn't, or the question isn't really competition, because charters are competing for the same teachers coming out of our schools of ed as the traditional schools. And the results with those same kids aren't very different. There's nobody banging it out of the park. We have a problem writ large. And in my mind, it really comes from what's the input? The key input is a teacher. Are they prepared? Can they do their job? Do they want to be there? Do they know how to teach the kids who don't learn naturally? And are we starting too late? Because the research shows us that we can make the biggest impact on the first 5 years of life of brains. We in America have entered this debate about charters because there's people who are mad at the union, although Al Shanker created the first charter. He was the head of the American Federation of Teachers. But we've gotten into a kind of an ideological debate about the governance structure and the finance structure, and they're worthwhile to have. There's plenty that should be changed. But one of the things we've seen in Pennsylvania is a 20-year experiment with charters, and some are doing really well, just like some public schools are doing really well. But in general, we've not gotten to the root of the problem. And that's what scares me, is that we spend the time talking about the issues that are not, to your point, Lenny, about what's happening in the classroom with the kids. That's my analysis.
Well, Lenny, you respond to Donna on any of those points if you'd like, but I also wanted to see if maybe you'd say a little bit about the non-traditional public school options and sort of how you see them playing out. So we talked a little bit about charters. Pennsylvania does also have a scholarship program for private schools. Obviously, a lot of states have even more robust forms of private school choice, vouchers, and so forth. So maybe if you can say a little bit about that and what you think the benefits, burdens of, say, charters versus private school choice programs are.
Some of what we look at is the red herring of this. We look at the charter school law from 1997 and say, well, we've done this experiment and it hasn't really worked out as well as we thought it was going to work out. Well, twofold. Number one, it has worked out for some. We have seen change. I mean, look, over the last decade of school years, we have seen an 87% increase in enrollment. If you take the pandemic out of it, you see a roughly 65% increase in enrollment. So parents are moving with their feet.
To move to charter schools.
Moving into charter schools. But more than that, I think one has to at least form the question, the experiment that we've done with public education since 1949, a school code that was written with the ink of redlining, that we often don't talk about, that is amended again and again and again and again and again, augmenting the same exact problems that we know we're not working and saying, let's just throw more money into it, or let's throw money into it sooner, and we're going to get a different result, is only basically trapping people in a system that we know has not worked for them in decades. Now, we have seen throughout American history that you can take kids that were former slaves and former sharecroppers, former immigrants coming off the boat, can't speak English, and within one generation, they become millionaires. One of the things I used to say when I was on the south side of Chicago talking about education, where I lived for 3 years, you can imagine being a moderate conservative living on the south side of Chicago, how lonely I would be. It's amazing I don't drink, because if I was going to, it would have been then. But one of the things I used to say about the south side was, this used to be a neighborhood where mom and dad used to be a janitor and a maid at a hotel. They'd have 3 kids. One kid would be a doctor, one kid would be a lawyer, and one kid owned those 3 buildings over there. Because even with parents that couldn't read and were struggling, certain things were in place. But some of those things that transpired even came through many of our scars. When you have a teaching base that cannot relate to the kids in the classroom, we have many, many school districts right now that are minority majority. Less than 6% of teachers in public schools, public district schools, are teachers of color. And we have districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that haven't had a teacher of color in there for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Now, I want you to think about this. If they're struggling to connect with that kid, and we're talking about charter and inner city schools, where I know in the charter sector, we're talking about roughly 70% Black and brown. We're talking about roughly 65% are eligible for free and reduced lunches. And we're talking about an employment base. And let's just be honest. When you talk about education in Pennsylvania, you're talking about hopefully educating kids, but a lot of people are talking about a job base. And when you're talking about an industry, and you're not talking about education, and education is an industry and not a vocation, you're never going to be on the same page, and that kid's best interest is never going to be served. So that kind of gets into, Michael, what you were talking about as far as the other options. Through the EITC, OSTC options, they're trying to do ESAs, which is education savings accounts. It's not quite passed yet in Pennsylvania. And of course, the public charter school movement, and you've seen that nationally. You've seen it over the course of the last 20 years, and you've particularly heard about it over the pandemic. Parents are saying we want to move. They just did a poll recently. At least 5 million families nationally would say, yes, if there are more charter schools, we'd go there, because we're not satisfied with our district school. They are saying, look, the district school failed me, my mother, my grandmother, and maybe even my great-grandmother. So when that kid comes into the school and we have these disparities where we can't even get connection in the district school, and we're blaming it on, well, maybe if they come a little bit early and we spend a little bit more money, knowing full well that the enrollment of public schools nationally has only gone up about 20% over the last 20 to 30 years. The amount of people enrolled, like I said, 20%, the amount of people employed in public education has gone up 168% over the last 30 years. So if the enrollment's gone up 20% and the people working there has gone up 168% and the spending has gone up even further, and we're still lagging behind the rest of the world, maybe it's not money, maybe it's approach, maybe it's access, and maybe we need to kickstart the innovation in how we teach our kids moving forward. And that's where school choice and charter schools can come into play, and they have been over the last 20 years.
Donna, again, want to respond to any of that, go ahead. I did want to also put on the table, though, more squarely, this question of results. I remember one line from an education policy course I took in law school, the professor saying, it's just hard to know what works, right?
Yes.
That it's hard to know what inputs produce good outputs on the student side. So maybe if you could speak a little bit about that, and from your own perspective and your own preferred positions, what you talked a fair bit about funding already, but what really would work in terms of producing better results given the system that we have?
Well, thank you so much. And I think Lenny is absolutely right. We have a really root issue in terms of the education core not reflecting the experience and able to relate to the experience of the students they're teaching. And there are a number of factors that cause people not to want to go into education, right? We used to be in Pennsylvania net exporter of teacher grads, right? We used to export 7,000 graduates of schools of education across this country after we hired for ourselves in PA. So school districts hired and there was still a 7,000 person surplus. And right now, according to the data, which I haven't really looked at closely, so I can't say I'm convinced, but what I hear is that we're about 4,000 teachers short of where we need to be hiring in terms of PA schools graduates. People could come from other states, and maybe the fastest way to diversify our teacher force, I keep saying to everybody, we should shut down our own schools of ed and hire from the South, because there are so many African-American students who go into education from the South, and let's bring them up here. Like, that's a strategy if we want to diversify, because our schools of ed are not recruiting heavily from students of color. It's an absolute real issue in our schools, and it doesn't matter what kind of school it is. On the alternative side, I do want to mention that there are 151 schools in the state where they have to take tax credit scholarships. And just so that's a small number, I don't know how many schools there are in the state, but there's 500 school districts. So just giving you a sense of scale. And the state spends about $185 million on the tax credit scholarships. And just again, to give you a sense of scale, for the funding that goes for the public schools and the charters, it's about $6.2 billion. So it's a small piece of the pie. A third of the schools that get tax credit scholarships cannot report on whether they are educating any low-income students. So although the program is intended for underwriting scholarships for low-income students, of the 151, 57 can't tell us if they have any low-income students attending. So there's accountability issues there. But performance is definitely an issue, right? So one of the good things that we we in Philly can beat ourselves up forever, right? Look, Pennsylvania has one of the toughest assessments in the country. It's called the PSSA. So anybody without a kid may not know, we have a really tough assessment. And it got tougher in 2015. In fact, Philadelphia School District, and this happened across the state, had about 52% of the kids reading on grade level at 2014. The state test got tougher in 2015, and we went down to 32%. So very tough test. That's good. Like in Alabama, they rank higher than us, like more kids pass their state assessment but probably every Philly kid could pass their state assessment, right? We do not have comparability across states when it comes to looking at performance. There's some normed states under the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's how we can point out Massachusetts and Maryland on these normed assessments. But I think that one of the things that Lenny talked about is sort of, people have choices in the economy, and the economy creates this sort of, that creates innovation. And, one of the things that's happened to America's teacher corps is that when I went to school, excuse me, I'm sorry, I did that, sound man. When I went to school, most of my teachers were women. And probably when some of you all went to school, most of your teachers were women. So maybe not, but a lot of women were teachers. I mean, New York City School District, I think, was like even the #1 hire of a woman in America at that point. And there weren't a lot of economic choices for women. So the smartest women became teachers. And as we learned in the economy that women had value in so many other places, women had more choices, women exercised more choices. And so we are competing to bring the best into teaching. And one of the things that, while we don't want to talk about money and say money doesn't matter, if in the competitive labor market, you can't get the best people, if you can't hire the best people, you can't get the best results. And a very startling study done in the early 2000s found that school districts in America were having to hire from the bottom third of the SATs. And the reason they're having to hire from the bottom third of the SATs is that's who's going into schools of ed. That's who's raising their hand to be teachers. So on some level in America, we've somehow sent the signals, whether they're monetary or status, and sometimes they're very intertwined. The question of who's in front of the classroom today is very different than when I grew up in terms of the caliber of individuals. And then the way you become a teacher is very different than when I went to school. You couldn't go to school you didn't get your education degree. You got a content degree with an education certification. So that plays against diversity on some level, right? Putting more barriers into who goes into the labor force for teachers could work against diversity unless we make that decision all across the country. But without question, Black and Hispanic students in our schools do not see people they can relate to in the front of the classroom. And we're not making the systemic changes to cause that to change, nor are we making the systemic changes to cause the quality of individuals that are choosing to be teachers, not quality as individuals, they're great people, the capacity of those individuals to be great teachers. You talked about Joan talked about the international competition in math and science. When America looked at the scores of where we scored the highest, I think it was Minnesota. Is that where you're from? Minnesota. Go Minnesota. And the top, like, where did we compete with Singapore in TIMSS, the Test of International Math and Science? In Minnesota. Look at why did that happen there? The schools that participated, their math and science teachers were master's level, not educators, master's level math and science teachers. They had a master's certificate, a bachelor's, and a master's in math, a bachelor's in science, and a master's in science. And so that's how they competed with Singapore. So again, I know we want to talk about choice, and we think it's really important, but when all the choices are not, when the choices aren't really making the difference, it's deeper than just choice. I live in Fishtown. My neighborhood parents choose charters, and then they come back to the neighborhood elementary school, because what happens in Philly is you are shopping. You're shopping, you're looking for a nice school, a safe school, small classrooms, but the charters have large classes too, just like the Philly district, because of the constraint of resources. So we have somehow created a debate where we think we shouldn't need to talk about money when we talk about education. And Lenny's absolutely right. The price of education has risen much more quickly than the number of children going. But the fact is, if you have the resources for classes at 27 and 30, parents are going to shop. They're constantly shopping in Philly to try and find a better place and sometimes they find it, which is great. Whether it's a charter or a public, I don't care. But what I know is in Philly, your choices And if you speak to the charter school principals here, they speak exactly like the public school principals. We don't have the resources we need to educate our kids. They might have less bureaucracy, kudos, it's great. They don't have the fundamental inputs it takes for their kids to succeed.
Michael,
So-
there's a lot I want to unpack in that. So let me get to that if I may, please.
Yeah, well, I just, so we'll turn to question and answers, but you have one more turn, and any of that, teacher
there's a lot
training
there.
or resources, wherever you'd like to respond to.
So
and then we'll
let
have
me,
Q&A.
there's several things that I'm kind of stick in my mind. First of all, it's the accountability issue with the EITC, OSTC, and I gasped a little bit as a scholarship kid that when you said that, because EITC and OSTC is constrained to people that are under certain socioeconomic levels. Part of the reason why those schools don't report who's getting those scholarships is so that those kids are not castigated on campus and they're not.
Oh, not
basically
who, just a
stereotyped.
number. No,
So,
who,
well,
yeah.
well, the bottom line is they
Yeah.
do that so that all the kids can be seen as being equal. Look, when I went to Shadyside Academy, I drove a 1977 Oldsmobile station wagon on campus and had to park it beside my two classmates that had a
With
BMW and
Mercedes.
literally had a
Yeah.
DeLorean.
Yeah, right, nice.
Okay, and it's true story.
Yeah.
Also had a kid at Davidson had a DeLorean. So, but in order for me to not be looked at and looked down upon as a college scholarship kid, they do that with the reporting and then they encourage that on campus. So it's not necessarily an accountability issue. It's already written into the state law. You know, in regards to Alabama, that was, you know, as my wife's a Southerner and I lived in North Carolina for 10 years. And, you know, that's one of the things that we were here oftentimes about, you know, the dumb Southerner. But, you know, businesses are smart enough to move to the South because they're seeing an educated workforce down there. So if those test scores are higher and the jobs are moving down there and the people are having a higher quality of life in Alabama, they must be doing something better than us up here in Pennsylvania. We're the people that are losing talent, particularly. I know we're talking about diversity a lot, but you know, Black folks in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia have been going down to the South for 40 years because they cannot stay in Pennsylvania because they are not finding opportunity to be here in Pennsylvania, which kind of goes to the economy aspect of things, which it's a little bit of a red herring saying if we pay teachers more, we're going to get a bigger yield. Went to Shadyside Academy on scholarship. Prior to that, I went to Pittsburgh Central Catholic. I can assure you that they were making about 1/3 less than a teacher in the city of Pittsburgh who starts out right now at $47,000 a year, and the average teacher in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is making $67,000 a year. I guarantee you that teacher at Central Catholic High School or at Shadyside Academy would love to start off their career at that level. But I assure you, you take a kid from Shadyside Academy and put him up against a kid at Pittsburgh Public School, and you say, okay, who do you think is going to go to college? Who do you think is going to have a higher earning potential throughout their life? Who's probably going to be in a two-parent household? Who's probably going to stay together? And who's probably going to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren? We already know the answer to that question. So when we start talking about these things and throwing out these issues in regards to it's about the money and who we're paying and this, that, and the other, we're seeing models where that doesn't necessarily jive. The truth of the matter is, when it comes to choice, and one other thing that you said that I wanted to make sure I addressed, and I apologize for kind of rehashing a couple of these things. But part of the reason why charter school leaders say that we don't have the resources is because we have put artificial caps on enrollment on charter schools in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because we're afraid of that competition. Right now, we have roughly 50,000 kids across the Commonwealth that are trying to get out of their district schools right now. I previously mentioned the 5 million families that are trying to get into charter schools right now. Now, of course, if you keep 1/4 of every dollar that's supposed to be assigned to a charter school kid from the state and it stays at the school district, and you limit enrollment, and you limit the amount of schools that you can have, and you keep pushing back, of course those charter schools are going to be fighting against any type of resources and sounding a lot like a district school. The difference is the school that is more empowered to have innovation, when they have it, they succeed. When you compare them to the district school that those kids are coming from, you could see it in the test scores, the quality of
Not
life,
here.
what they do with their jobs, are they attached to the criminal justice system, and are they having babies early?
Not here.
All 5 of those things
Not here.
show it absolutely does. And it plays nationally, it plays
Yeah,
in,
I agree.
it plays in New York, it plays in Pennsylvania, it plays in Wisconsin. You see the quality of life go up with school choice across the board, in particularly for the underserved communities that we're trying to serve here in Pennsylvania. So to restrain that artificially, because all these things are put in place by the General Assembly, your representatives are making a decision that oftentimes go against the best interest of what we need in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to bring this Commonwealth back. We're at a pivot point. The pandemic has shown us that parents want more choice, not less. They want more options, not less. And that this is the time for everybody to be in it together and not pit one against the other and try to double and triple down on a system that we know doesn't work for everybody. That's why it's so important to have these conversations about choice for parental empowerment, not for economic shifting around of money and who's going to get more funding, who's going to be the winner, who's going to be the loser.
I want to be sure to turn to some audience questions now, and you can each chime in quickly if you could so that we can get through as many as possible. But one question, we started with Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Let's zoom out to the rest of the world. Have you looked at any international leaders in education, for example, Finland, and how we in the US could adopt some of their policies and approaches? So are there international examples that you think can be particularly held up?
Finland's it. So, and look, it's kind of trite because Finland is a very small country and it's a very homogeneous country. But even, they've had some immigration over the last 15 years and their results, again, it's a little bit like America in the old days, right? You brought in your immigrants and they did really well. It's not easy to do apples and oranges, but Finland is the place which has the highest results in the world, and their teacher training approach is very much akin to what I've talked to you about. And business leaders from across America, U.S. Chamber, Council for a Strong America, business leaders regularly are asking the U.S. Department of Education, what can we do to replicate the processes for teacher education in Finland? Most of our principals were former teachers, right? And so if you can get the teachers really, really to understand content and pedagogy, then you can actually run a better school. Now, I also think that we should probably be not hiring principals and superintendents only from our teacher corps. That's a real constraining. You have to have your teacher certificate to be a principal or a teacher in Pennsylvania, and it constrains who can be those. And one of the reasons that some charters have succeeded is because they have an executive director as opposed to a superintendent, or they have a CEO, and that person can really drive an engine better than a typical principal. And I think of Mastery in Philly. We know Mastery Charter School in Philly and KIPP, right? And if their CEOs were sitting here, they would say, I need counselors. I need social workers. That the difference between Shadyside or Pittsburgh Catholic is 100% of my kids, not 10, not 20, not 30, 100% of my kids are coming from poor families, high dysfunction. Somebody's life has been disrupted in their family, so they're not there. And their ability to both deal with the fact that their teacher corps is not where they need it to be, and they don't have the social supports for their students. So the issue about money isn't simply about paying teachers more. It's understanding it's apples to oranges to compare Shadyside and what it takes to get production out of 100% of the kids there, and to take Harding Middle School in Frankfurt and say you're going to get the same results if you paid the teachers what you paid them in Shadyside. It's just apples and oranges given the experience of these children. And as you know, Philadelphia had to eliminate all its school counselors in 2010. We're back now to every school having one counselor, but you can have schools with 400 kids and one counselor. We have about 120 social workers in the schools now, which is a radical change from the past. And in those schools, teachers will tell you, it's so much easier to teach my kids because there's somebody that kid can talk to. There's somebody that parent can talk to deal with the fact that they don't have clothes, don't have food. Somebody got shot last night. They got thrown off of their healthcare system. I mean, this is what's happening in classrooms every day, unfortunately. And so I don't want to spend money for money's sake, but I do think it is very different than in Shadyside. But I do think in Finland, the social dysfunction is lower. So it's not simply the great teaching process in Finland. It's recognizing that in a place of high poverty, if we're not going to deal with poverty, we have to deal with the symptoms of it. And one of them is education, but the other is the stress, the fear, the anxiety, the depression, the alienation that it causes children to come to school with. That's a sad statement on where we are right now, but that's real. And that's real in a charter, and that's real in a public school in Philadelphia. And even some of the mission Catholic schools will tell you the same thing, that they see the exact same thing.
You know, Mother Teresa Academy up in Erie, Pennsylvania, 100% children of color, many of them immigrants coming from the poorest neighborhoods in Erie. Their test scores are higher. They're using the EITC and OSTC money to get into that Catholic school, to have an opportunity. English may be a second language, but instead of English being a second language as Spanish, it might be Somali, it might be Arabic. They may be running from a civil war in Syria. You'd be surprised how many international communities are up in the northwest corner of the state. By the way, Erie is still part of Pennsylvania. I don't know if you Philadelphia. But with the same kids coming from the same backgrounds, with teachers that are making 1/3 less. So I know you wanted to focus on Shady Side. Let's move it to Mother Teresa.
Absolutely.
They're coming into K-8 and they're getting a higher academic yield for less money per student, less money for the school, and kids from the same backgrounds that are hearing about people being shot. They're having to walk past kids that are going through a lot of crime and a lot of tribulations. You know, my old grade school in Pittsburgh, St. James School, which became Sister Thea Bowman. They literally had, and this may sound familiar, unfortunately, to a lot of you Philadelphians, they literally had a gunshot victim dead laying in the driveway as these kids are coming to school. They literally in a school district that couldn't afford to have a high school, and the kids are failing in the grade schools, but they're going to Mother Teresa, and with the EITC and OSTC money through school choice, they're now eligible to go to Shady Side Academy, Winchester Thurston, the Ellis School, Pittsburgh Central Catholic High School, and the like. The bottom line is we can look at models overseas, but we have to understand that in America, we have a very unique dynamic. Finland's not worried about protecting the rest of the world with their national economy. Just the same, you look at how they take care of their citizens, hang out, some of the stipends that they pay out, as well as how they take care of you from literally pre-K all the way through your education system. We're not going to try to afford that in the United States of America and make sure that we're safe and make sure that we are the geoeconomic leader of the world. We have a different obligation. And we have proven over the course of our history that if we apply things in a particular way with the American spirit and make sure that we're being fair to the districts, but also making sure that we're not constraining people with some of our flaws, we can get past this. We don't necessarily have to mirror what's going on in Finland. We could take some things, take some lessons learned, but trying to extrapolate something from a very small country, to Donna's point, and bring it to a country of over 325 million with the diversity that we have, we're asking for another failure. And we have generations of kids that just can't afford another failure in education.
We're right up toward the end of our time, so I'll ask one more question, and if you could, in 90 seconds each. So if you were, someone said, if you were in charge of your king or queen for the day of education in America or Pennsylvania, what one policy, legal change would you make immediately to transform American education?
Only one.
One. You have to sell it to us in 90 seconds.
Again, I've sort of followed the research. So I do believe that we need to have universal high quality pre-K for at least 2 years, if not 3, for every child in communities that are low income to really change the trajectory of them. You see it in our schools when we can do that. So that's probably what I would say.
So your question was if I could be king or queen of Pennsylvania for today, for one day. So if I were Tom Wolfe, that's a joke on the constitutional amendments that we just passed, ban that. What I would probably do is in education, I would try to put some type of fiscally responsible plan in place that would allow every Pennsylvania family to go find the school that best fits their needs. Understanding that if you live in Fox Chapel in Pittsburgh, you're going to take your kids to Fox Chapel High School and you're going to get a good education. But if you live in the Homewood Brushman section of Pittsburgh, where my mother grew up, you're probably going to send your kids to a Catholic school. And if you are Jewish, you may send your kids to Hillel Academy. You're going to be able to be self-empowered to make sure that your kids have the tools necessary to be all that they want to be all that you envision them to be and all that they can be in America?
Well, it is 7:28, so I think we will end just a minute early so that John can give some announcements. But before we do that, before I turn it over to John, I want to thank both of you for a robust conversation.
Anybody that's interested, I have a few background reports on sort of what's going on race in our schools, what's going on with Philly families and economics, and what's going on state funding. I'll leave them over here if you want them.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to the Union League Legacy Foundation for sponsoring the event. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Michael, Lenny, Donna, thank you so much. The only thing I can say is I wish we had another hour. I said to this group, my goal was to educate people about the issues and to hear about some possible solutions. And we just got to the beginning of that, but you've taught me a lot, and I'm sure our audience a lot. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I'm really thrilled that we are going to have in-person programming from here forward. And the next two, but you know, it's a long time since we've done this, when we've more than doubled the size of the property of the Union League since the last time we had an in-person program. And so we're going to have two of the programs we have coming up are not here, but they're at other locations. One is at UL National on June 28th. We're going to have a Civil War Roundtable. The Union League and Generals Sherman, Grant, and Meade. And we're doing that because those golfers out there will know that the 3 9-holes down there are called Sherman, Grant, and Meade. So that'll be with Jim Mundy and myself. On July 12th, we'll be at Liberty Hill. We'll be talking about a different war, the Revolutionary War and the Battle of Barron Hill, which occurred in part on the property that we now own in Lafayette Hill. And then on July 28th, we're going to be back here in a good old-fashioned Union League Civil War Roundtable. We're going to talk about Pickett's Charge. So we look forward to seeing you at these and all the other programs here at the Union League, here at 140 South Broad, down the shore, in Lafayette Hill, and all over the great area of Philadelphia. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for an enlightening program. Thank you. Good night.